Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And now in the papers, as usual, as I promised, lots and lots of Trump. Trump accuses Obama of a new Watergate plot, says the Sunday Telegraph. They've also got the story about trading that you're listening to on the news there. T levels, the Chancellor wants to talk about rather than A levels. And there's the Sunday Times. Again, a rather unsettling, unpleasant picture of Donald Trump with his tie blowing up against his comb over. And then Chancellor's £60 billion Brexit fighting fund, it claims. Lots to talk about there later on the programme. There's The Observer, an interesting story here about a watchdog looking into claims that to drill down into voters, information and privacy laws are possibly being broken. Trump again there, shouting. And then finally that story on the Mail on Sunday, Blair's secret White House summit. And it claims that he's going to be Trump's Middle East peace envoy. Before the programme opened, we were actually phoned by Blair's office to say this was not true. John Sobel knows a lot more about that story, and we'll be talking to him shortly about it. But let's start off, Stephanie, with the overall picture of the economy just before Philip Hammond's first budget. And there's an impression in a lot of the papers, yesterday as well as today, that he's got 12 billion or so for extra money to spend, and it's going to be a giveaway budget of some kind. What do you think?
Well, I think that the Treasury is very keen to douse that impression. And in fact, there's Dan Hodges in the Mail on Sunday saying the budget in 4 words, batten down the hatches. You know, it's not a Brexit, the first Brexit budget. It's the last pre-Brexit budget, he says. And the Chancellor is going to be very keen to, if there is a bit more room for manoeuvre, and there probably are going to be a few more billions in his...
Is it better than expected tax receipts, the economy doing slightly better than projected?
The growth forecasts are going to be revised up from what we thought even 3 months ago, because the economy has done better. Tax revenues have been coming in. But we still have this huge question mark about what happens to the economy as we see more about the shape of the deal that we get and what the UK is going to look like after it leaves the EU.
And so the metaphor here is not that we're going to go into terrible times because of Brexit, but just that the sky is a slightly strange colour. And we're sailing towards it, so get those cleats tied up, batten down the hatches and be careful.
And I suspect Mr Hammond would quite like to have a contrast between him and some previous chancellors. Even George Osborne was not beyond spending the money that came his way when he got some nice forecasts, and then a year later having come back to us and raise it again.
And Philip Hammond himself has been writing in the papers a bit today.
Yes, we've got a couple.
There's
a couple of op-eds he's done for The Sun and also for the Sunday Times, really focusing, you mentioned it, on the T levels and in general on the fact that, you know, it's not just about having room for manoeuvre in the public finances. We've got these problems with our economy, particularly low productivity growth, output per head growth, which has been at the heart of our economic problems long before the Brexit vote. And training and skills is one of those areas that keeps coming back. And this is going to be another budget that promises to do something about that and make us give proper routes to people who are not just going to go the academic route, but the training route. I think I would say I like the idea of this, but I've been chairing an inclusive growth commission over the last year for the Royal Society of Arts, going around the country, taking evidence on what could really solve some of these problems. They agree on training and skills, but it's not just about money. Everywhere across the country says we need to have more freedom to make this right for our place.
It has to be delivered locally.
Well, it has, and I think we just need a new relationship between the centre and local, not just here, but on social care, all those things.
And at this moment, Helen Lewis, former boss of the Treasury, Sir Nicholas Macpherson, wades in with a U-turn on death tax, it says.
Well, I think it's a really interesting piece in the FT. One I think is fascinating about it is he said, you know, he's worked on 34 budgets and they've all had productivity and growth as a theme. And during all that time, the growth rate has remained stubbornly unchanged at 2.25%. And, you know, we're political journalists, we take our excitement where we can get it. But, you know, the fact is that actually the tax take tends to move around, but often the story of budgets is how little changes. And I think this is an interesting one. We've been talking about social care and the death tax. And actually, those big decisions that we have to make about an ageing population are still being slightly kicked down the road.
Because with the triple lock, pensioners are still pension households are the only households on the country who seem to be doing better and better and better. Everybody else is having a hard time. And as you say, we are all ageing. We can't help it. And that makes big problems for the Treasury.
Yeah, and then we've also got Labour's response here. So the interesting thing about John McDonnell writing here in the Sunday Mirror is he's got a series of policies that are individually popular. You know, renationalising the railway. Actually, there's quite a lot of support for capping energy prices, a £10 an hour minimum wage. The question question is whether or not that adds up to a package that people like.
And can they pay for its credibility? Now, John, let's talk about President Trump and those tweets. What a story.
Extraordinary. It's hard to describe what it's like living in the US at the moment, where you wake up and you think, I wonder what he said now. And yesterday was an absolute classic. And it's kind of very interesting. I just thought it would be interesting to contrast the way the British press are covering it, which is Trump launches Twitter storm. So this is the Washington Post. Trump, citing no evidence, accuses Obama of Nixon Watergate. Just so you don't think it's just the liberal media, I'm just going to bring up the Wall Street Journal here. Trump faces furore over unsubstantiated claim Obama wiretapped him. Of course, the Wall Street Journal owned by Rupert Murdoch. We can carry on. The LA Times now. Citing no evidence, Trump accuses Obama of tapping his phones during the election. So it seems that even the American media think they have to point out that, look, he said all this stuff, we're going to cover him, he is the leader of the free world after all, but evidence is there none.
And he has called Obama sick and sad and bad and all the rest of it. What is going on? Is this purely an attempt to deflect from his own problems with Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, under trouble over his Russian links and so on? Throw something into the social media, everyone will follow it, and they will forget what was going on before.
Possibly. He has used that to good effect in the past, but the problems come back to Russia and the links. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence. There's absolutely no evidence of any untoward contacts. But it is just so strange. I mean, the joke going around Washington at the moment is that the Russian ambassador, Kislyak, is the most boring man in the city. Why? Because no one ever remembers meeting him. And that is kind of one of the narratives that's come. Why are there so many meetings with the Russians? And Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, had 2 of them that he completely forgot to mention when he was under oath at his confirmation hearing.
Looking from the outside, you'd think that somebody making that kind of, quote, mistake under oath in front of Congress would be out.
Well, to use the verb that got currency this week, he has recused himself from any investigation into the links. I think that he's, Andrew, to use a Scottish phrase, I think his coat is hanging by a shookily peg, I think they say.
Absolutely.
And,
very good.
And I think that he would be, you know, I don't think he can afford any more mishaps. And I think Donald Trump is raging at the world. He is raging in Mar-a-Lago in Florida at the leaks that are taking place that the Washington Post managed to find out about the Jeff Sessions meeting with the ambassador. He's raging at his own officials for the way they are handling it. He's raging at the media over the way we're reporting it. He is not a happy bunny.
Stephanie, you've been following this story too. It is one of the most extraordinary moments in modern American political history. We've never had a president behave like this.
And I think the Russia thing is the weak point, because it's also the area where he is so far at odds with everybody in his party, everyone in Washington. And it's hard to overestimate sort of how esoteric, how odd in a US context his support or his favourable comments about Russia are. There's almost no one in Congress in either party that has actually had this favourable view of President Putin, and it's the thing that his own party finds hardest to swallow. So the fact that these meetings and everything else just keep coming back, you can see why it riles him.
Now, what we haven't talked about enough probably at sort of London News Central for a while is the Northern Ireland elections, because that has been a very, very important shift in Northern Irish politics. Sinn Féin up, the DUP down. Helen.
Yeah, I think it's a huge omission, and actually it was a big omission from the Brexit campaign as well. You know, Northern Ireland got so little coverage. We worked on an edition of the New Statesman, Gordon Brown, and he said, well, I just can't believe this isn't at all being discussed on the mainland. But the results are interesting. So the Stormont Assembly has gone down in seats anyway, so there was a shrinkage and a contraction. But the big story is the fact that the Unionists, for the first time, don't have an overall majority. Now, that has a couple of interesting effects. Sinn Féin's current position is, you know, we don't want to work with Arlene Foster, the DUP leader, whose cash for ash scandal was what prompted this whole election. So there's the possibility of another election in 3 weeks. There's a possibility of direct rule from Westminster. And I think, as Adam Bolton's saying here, you know, while all eyes have been on Scotland and whether or not they'll have another referendum, actually, you know, Northern Ireland might have one foot out the door.
It's a thoroughly interesting piece, this, isn't it? Because he's saying that in due course, Northern Ireland might leave the Union over all of this eventually. And at that point, if Scotland goes to England faces a kind of Celtic union of Scotland and Ireland to the north and west, a completely different kind of country.
Yeah, and an absolutely unintended consequences of Brexit might be to say that if we leave the customs union, we're leaving the single market, then actually what you have to do is put in custom checks at ports on the island of Ireland. And that increases the idea that it is one unified whole. So something that got almost no discussion at all has become a huge political issue. Helen,
you mentioned the word Brexit. Stephanie, there's a very interesting piece by Andrew Rawnsley here in The Observer.
We have a lot of things building up here, but he does make a good point that we've ended up, Theresa May, who was supposed to have a reputation for being the cautious, the careful, the vicar's daughter, is actually setting up quite a few gambles in the way she's positioned herself in the government going into these Brexit negotiations. And as he points out, there's a gamble that the economy will stay okay, and she doesn't need to have an election anytime soon, she'll still be all right, that the deal will somehow be politically tolerable, and that everything else will also work out, when in fact we might have thought she'd be lowering expectations around that deal, telling people, you know, this is going to be difficult, and reminding
May with
people.
A wild gambler's glint in her eye. That is an image I haven't seen before.
Well, the idea,
we're
not being prepared for the idea that this is going to cost us money, and that could be a very risky strategy.
Now, John, I want to turn to the other story of the day, which is Tony Blair, Donald Trump's peace envoy in the Middle East, ? Answer no.
Answer no. Jared Kushner, who's Donald Trump's son-in-law, is meeting all sorts of experts as they try to formulate a Middle East policy that makes sense. And you can watch the trajectory of the way they've been trying to formulate policy. The embassy was going to move to Jerusalem, now it's not. The Israelis could build settlements, well, maybe that's not such a good idea. And so it goes on. I'm not in favour of a two-state or a one-state solution. It's whatever solution. Actually, we do favour the two-state solution. And I think Tony Blair, who was in Washington last week, went in there and as a former head of the Quartet group, to probably talk to them about, you know, look, this is a good guy, this is not so good, these are the people you should meet. But I don't think there's any prospect at all of him having any role. Also, from what I understand, is he's much more focused on trying to reinvigorate the centre ground and this new foundation he's setting up. And the last thing I should suspect he feels he needs is to be seen
holding hands with Donald Trump.
Holding hands exactly with Donald Trump.
Yeah,
so I kind of think that probably there were meetings. I don't think any of the rest of it is true.
Helen, before we end the paper review, much on the Labour Party this week? I mean, it went quite quiet after those by-election problems.
Yeah, I think with the idea of the zombie Labour Party has kind of taken on. It's sort of staggering on, but it's not quite dead at the moment. But I think basically the problem has come down to succession, and that's as much a problem for the Corbyn sceptics as for the Corbyn, supporters. Nobody's got an obvious heir apparent anymore.
So I'm told that people on the Blair wing of the party and on the Corbyn wing of the party are spending quite a lot of time under the radar trying to groom new successors, the next generation.
And the trouble is that a lot of these people came in 2015, so, they might be incredibly talented, but they're just very, very green. But the big thing that's coming up in autumn conference is what's being called the McDonnell Amendment. So at the moment, you might remember from the excitement of leadership elections past, you need 15% of MPs or MEPs to nominate you to get on the ballot. That is seen as being a huge block to another kind of Corbyn heir, someone from that wing getting on. They want to reduce it to 5%, so that's the big battle to come.
I better ask him about that. Now, the generation in the saddle, in charge. Thank you all very much for the news. That was very interesting.
Well, we're joined now by the financial analyst Louise Cooper, the chief political correspondent at The Times, Michael Savage, and the economist and author Linda Yu. Hello, and thanks for being with us this Sunday morning. Lots to talk about. It feels like we should kick off with the budget, doesn't it? We're getting a few hints about what there could be, a few teasers about what the Chancellor's got in store. Sunday Times says he's got a £60 billion Brexit fighting fund. Sounds quite dramatic.
I think it might be I think, I'm not sure if I would call it a war chest. So let's kind of break down where this number comes from. We know that by modifying the budget rules that he had given himself not to run a balanced budget by the end of the Parliament in 2020, they're about £27 billion. That's a bit of a cushion for what might happen to the economy in the coming years. But because of stronger growth, upgrading growth to about 2% and also better tax receipts, there's about another £29 billion. Which looks like it's a windfall. So I think the way to think about the 60 billion...
A bit sceptical, basically.
I think it's probably right for him to say, well, let's see what comes up in the next few years, and then let's decide what to do with it. So I wouldn't expect too much in the spring budget on Wednesday. Remember, the big centerpiece for the budget is actually in the autumn. But what we are expecting are a few things which I think will be very catchy T levels. I heard you talk about it earlier in the program. putting in about £500 million to boost vocational training. Another 1.3 billion or so be put into social care, an area which is obviously needs quite a lot of investment. And the Times piece also says that Philip Hammond will drop a long-term plan about what to do with health and social care.
So there are a few rabbits then in the budget. What are you expecting, Louise?
It's quite interesting. The front page of the Times is based on, I mean, the Sunday Times got the Oscar this week. They got Philip Hammond in their paper. None of the others did, so they're quite happy.
Well done, Tim Shipman.
Yeah, they didn't award it to the wrong person. Anyway, so Philip Hammond, 15 paragraphs, on the same page as Rod Liddle, which always makes me laugh. Anyway, 15 paragraphs of Phil Hammond, right at the very top. An economy that works for everyone.
We haven't heard that before, have we?
No, and right at the very bottom as well, an economy that works for everyone. So I imagine if you want to bet, I would bet on the amount of times he says the economy that works for everyone in the budget on Wednesday. But the other thing is, if you actually analyse what he talked about, very clearly in 4 separate ways, he's basically saying, don't expect a giveaway budget. So he talks about, we need to maintain our commitment to fiscal discipline first. This budget will maintain our course to bring the public finances back to balance. Second, there are calls for huge spending sprees. That approach is confused, reckless and unsustainable. And the fourth time, we have to, as a country, live within our means. So this will not be a giveaway budget.
Spreadsheets Phil, lives up to its name.
And then the other thing he says really quite clearly is it's all about jobs, education and skilling up to be a higher productive economy. He says that 5 times. What is really interesting is not once within all these words has he used 3 letters, N, H and S.
This is very true.
Not
isn't
once.
It? The political kind of issue at the moment, if you think of it. Of course, one of the other big political issues is covered in the Telegraph, isn't it? This is the Northern Ireland political elections here. I thought it was quite interesting, Michael Savage, the day that Theresa May was in Glasgow defending the union was the day that in Northern Ireland the Unionists lost their majority.
Yeah.
And this could have huge implications.
So this is the problem that Theresa May faces, that for all the success she's having in the polls and everything else, there are these huge tensions on Scotland, Northern Ireland, on the Union really, as a result of Brexit, that are sort of pulling apart at British identity. And we've got a piece here by Tim Stanley who makes the point that if the common interests of Britain seem to be divergent, that is, you have these regions, Scotland, Northern Ireland, that might have voted to remain in the EU, then suddenly there's a huge contested issue about what we mean about being British. And the idea of being British actually gets challenged. And this whole crisis in Northern Ireland is quite an interesting one because it's again about unintended consequences. No one really saw this coming, sort of triggered by a political crisis around the DUP, and suddenly in the Assembly there's no unionist majority for the first time. The DUP don't have a veto on policies which they used to do. You know, this is another one of those sharks circling around Theresa May that she has to deal with.
I mean, the Northern Ireland situation could have huge implications, couldn't it, for the rest of the United Kingdom? Don't you think it could, Linda?
Yeah, it can. And I think if you take it with the Scotland situation, it basically raises questions about how these regions will feel if we do a hard exit. So that is taking the UK, which it looks like we're on the course to, out of the single market, because they feel that this is, first of all, against what they voted for in the referendum, but secondly, the economic impact would be severe. But you're right, Northern Ireland is particularly a hard case because there's also the issue of the hard border. And because the Unionists no longer have their majority, I think there will be issues around customs procedures and whether or not we're going to return to a time that nobody in Ireland wants to. And let's be clear, regardless of the outcome of whether it's a soft or hard Brexit, we are going to get customs checks at the borders. That's the definition of leaving the single market. Everything has to be checked.
There's lots of goodwill in the EU to help solve this Irish issue because they're very sensitive about it, but the solutions are just not simple.
Yeah, very serious stuff indeed. Now, Louise, I want to talk about the story with you. This is the new head of London's fire service.
I might leave you to read the headline.
Can I say this on a Sunday morning?
I have no idea. I'm not your editor.
Let's see what happens.
She's talking about the hairy body part that you can use your imagination.
I'm waiting to see. Are we going to see the piece on the graphic? Have they?
I think they put it on screen. So
they put it on screen. Right. Well, anyway.
Yes,
so look, this is the only. The Observer's got the only paper to get this. It's an interview with a lady called Danny Cotton, I think. She is the first ever female head of London's fire service, and she's about the same age as me. She's 47, and it's extraordinary. She joined in 1988 when she was 18. And it's a really inspiring story. She says, I was 18, she joined at 18. I was 18 and I had no concept that a woman couldn't or shouldn't do anything. I came from a family with strong matriarchs, an East End grandmother was one, and I simply had the view, why can't I? And yet she was only one of 3 women in her year that made it through. She was only the 30th woman out of 6,000 in the service. And she says it was very, very macho. The exact quote is, the issue for some firemen is that if a woman can do the job, then it isn't the big hero job it was. It demachos their role. Well done, Danny.
Fireman Sarah, apparently the bane of her life. There you go. Yeah. Thanks very much for the 3 of you. Very lively paper review this morning.
On a trip north of the border, she said politics isn't a game, but it did look like proper war after Nicola Sturgeon signals she's minded to demand a second referendum on independence for Scotland, and the PM hinted she's likely to biff that. May herself got biffed by the House of Lords in spite of being defended by the Lords Howard, Lawson and, blast from the past, Tebbit, when their lordships voted to give rights of permanent residence to EU nationals living here, very much against her wishes. Meanwhile, politics turned into, well, comedy, when he said he didn't want the knighthood that our guest Douglas Carswell supposedly stymied, and then he play-acted being dubbed Sir Nigel by a little girl who promptly accused him of not liking foreigners. Never worked with children or dogs or politicians. Hey, Allegra, Screeny?
But pregnant women are always delightful, aren't they, Robert? Now, look, the Sunday Times tells us the Chancellor is readying a £60 billion Brexit fighting fund. Here you go. He may well need it because there's talk of a very large Brexit divorce bill, more later. Elsewhere, on the front of the Mail on Sunday, we have this story. They are alleging the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, has been courted to be Donald Trump's emissary to the Middle East. Tony Blair's office were in touch before breakfast to say this is basically fake news. Now, elsewhere, trouble for the current Labour leader. Are Corbynistas falling in love with Corbyn? We have an exclusive poll for you, done by the pollsters, YouGov, who were the first to predict Corbyn would become leader twice. They now detect a shift away from Corbyn. This is from the man who commissioned the poll. His Twitter handle is Election Data. He's called Ian Warren. And he points out, this is his headline, I think he's right, I've looked at the numbers in detail. My poll of UK Labour members shows more people, 50%, want Corbyn to stand down before the next election than Remain, 44. That has shifted. The other thing that shifted is this. When asked last year whether they approve or disapprove, look at this beautiful, beautiful graphic made by our producer Cass. It's was a very rosy picture, ha-ha. You have 72% that thought he was doing a good job versus 17. That has now changed. Now, we should say, so it's obviously gone down. It's still 54 think are approving, but it's shifted, probably important, up 37 now disapproving. It is a mixed picture. In terms of the runners and riders, it looks like the names in the frame are names you'll be familiar with, John McDonnell, Clive Lewis and Yvette Cooper. Robert.
Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Ed Balls and Douglas Carswell. Ed, we've seen a slump in Jeremy Corbyn's popularity ratings. Does that change anything, or do you think he will still be Labour leader in 2020, which is, at the moment, the likely date for the general election?
Well, you can see a slow change happening and his own supporters reappraising the situation.
Do you want him to go?
I'm afraid that well, look, I've been in your programme many times and said what I think about Jeremy Corbyn, but there was a leadership election last year. The problem is, if you look at that poll, still less than 30% of Labour members think that winning the general election is an important priority. And until we get back to the point where members and voters are aligned on policy and think winning matters, I'm afraid at the moment it doesn't really feel as though the change is happening fast enough.
I mean, quite striking, Douglas, that when you look at the detail of the poll, when Labour members are asked to name 4 people they think could lead, actually Yvette, Ed's wife, comes out top. Now, I can't ask Ed about Yvette's...
Should definitely get my vote. Ed got my vote on Strictly, and Yvette would definitely get my vote, but it's not up to me.
Now, let's nail you down on this issue of the knighthood.
Yeah.
Did you try and block Nigel's knighthood?
I was asked to lobby after a decision had been made. Even if the decision hadn't been made...
Oh, you mean by the Honours Committee? They'd already made up their minds
They
not
make their
to give
decision in November, apparently. I was asked to lobby in December. I was being asked to close the stable door after the horse had bolted.
And did you try and close that stable door?
I think it'd be curlish for Nigel not to get an honour that recognises his contribution.
Right.
And
What should that be?
I've lobbied for UKIP getting its share of peerages and honours, and I've been quite robust in doing that. Fundamentally, if a decision is made in November and you ask me to intervene in December, I'm afraid even with my powers,
but just to be clear, this charge from Aaron Banks that you tried to block it, you're saying that's rubbish?
I have no power to block anyone's money.
But you didn't want to block it, is what you're saying? Are you saying you didn't want...
Yeah. Absolutely.
I've got to say, it seems to me Douglas has behaved completely honourably in this matter. On the other hand, today, to have Paul Nuttall riding to your defence, I mean, it's a bit of a blow, isn't it, really? I mean, possibly the least credible politician in Britain at the moment, you know.
You like Paul Nuttall?
I do. I think Paul is great. I'm 100% behind him. You know, let's not... You know, your party leader's got a few issues. My party in Parliament is 100% behind our party leader in a way that perhaps your party isn't yet. So,
and do you whip yourself?
I do, but we occasionally have a backbench rebellion, but I crush it brutally and savagely.
I've been getting away with it all